We have the worst of all people in charge, the worst in our history, I would say, at a time when the world could hardly be more dangerous. A person might say the world is especially unpredictable at the moment. Maybe yes, maybe no. Perhaps it's only unpredictable if you haven't got a copy of the script, if you're not aware of the little men behind the curtain. There are Russian warships in the Bay of Havana in Cuba, 70 miles from Florida. Among the payloads aboard are Zircon hypersonic missiles capable of reaching the White House in minutes if a person had a mind to fire them that way. In the Ukraine, squad American ATACMS, Army tactical missile systems, ballistic weapons capable of hitting targets deep inside Russia. It's my opinion, just by the by, that Britain and America have been at war with Russia for a while now, not just using Ukraine as the proxy, but actually directly at war with Russia. What could possibly go wrong? The ghost of the Cuban Missile Crisis is back to haunt us with a vengeance. At precisely the moment when the nations of the West are run by, at the top of the pyramid of power, an apparently senile, elderly President of the United States of America, and below him, and dependent upon him, heaven help us all, a motley crew of underlings, like British Prime Minister Rishi Sunak, flanked by his equally unedifying Foreign Secretary David Cameron, the same Cameron that had to be given a seat in the House of Lords before he could flounce onto the international stage once more, and who, while Prime Minister himself, was infamously dubbed Dodgy Dave by Labour MP Dennis Skinner. But anyway, an unelected minister in a government led by an unelected Prime Minister, furtively waging war on Russia without so much as a by your leave. The kindling is piled high, soaked in petrol, and the sparks are flying, and instead of any statesman with the wisdom to dampen down the risk of a global conflagration, we have designer-suited placemen, servile marionettes that move and speak subject to the commands of others we did not elect and over whom we have no influence whatsoever. Everyone expects that monumentally ineffectual miniature Sunak and his party will be sent packing in a few weeks' time. No doubt he'll simply hand the baton to his uni-party teammate, Sir Keir Starmer, who will simply pick up where Sunak left off. The same Sunak who was memorably forgotten a while back as Rashid Sunak by the aforementioned demented wreck of Joe Biden. Starmer will press on with the globalist agenda, only faster and harder than his immediate predecessor, whose seat he will keep warm with the other cheek of the same arse. While the missiles simmer in Havana, in Ukraine, we're invited to watch the pantomime of a general election, cheered on by those that either genuinely believe the general election will change anything, or else have so much personally at stake that they must appear to believe. For me, it's like watching the last days of the dinosaurs lurching and stumbling around while their successors, fast-moving and adaptable little mammals, move around in their shadows. Those mammals are misidentified by the mainstream media, willfully slandered indeed as dangerous right-wing extremists, when what they really are is the manifestation of what more and more ordinary, decent, regular people all over the world actually want, which is political parties that at least appear to be listening to their cries of anguish, their cries for help. Across the channel, there's French President Emmanuel Macron, another leader who appears as though viewed through the wrong end of a telescope, so badly whipped in the European elections that he has seen fit to call a snap election of his own. German Chancellor Olaf Scholz received a drubbing as well, but has ruled out an early plebiscite. In Belgium, the Prime Minister Alexander De Croo wept on live television as he tendered his own resignation following his own defeat. In all three cases, in France, Germany and Belgium, the damage to globalist liberal types was the consequence of pesky proles daring to vote for parties that globalists routinely label right-wing, if not far-right. Globalist puppets are flapping helplessly like the empty socks they are, Sunak, Macron, De Croo, exposed as the nothings they truly are, no more than factotums, willingly serving the needs of whomever is actually in charge and calling the shots. As I say, you can spot the up-and-coming contenders because they're vilified as little better than fascists and Nazis. Which brings me to the ceremony in the French village of Oradour-sur-Glane, attended by Macron and German President Frank-Walter Steinmeier, marking the 80th anniversary of the massacre there by SS Nazis of 643 villagers in a revenge attack in response to actions by the French resistance. I personally find the commemoration of such horrors by our present crop of so-called leaders especially hard to watch. I observe the bowing of heads in seeming reflection of terrible wrong, and then remember an actual SS Nazi veteran being given a standing ovation earlier this year in the Canadian Parliament in front of a clapping Justin Trudeau and Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky, fist raised in salute. I watch solemn remembrance at Oradour-sur-Glane and think about our own former British Prime Minister Boris Johnson proudly celebrating as heroes members of the Ukrainian Azov Brigade, an outfit formed in 2014 with the aim, according to its then leader, of ridding the world of Semite Untermensch. I watch all this and ask myself again, who won the Second World War? Were the Nazis the baddies or not? The world has not been more dangerous than it is now at any moment in any of our lifetimes. When the Cuban Missile Crisis unfolded in 1962, the US President John F. Kennedy was fully compos mentis, certainly able to make his own way to the restroom when required, and the Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev could walk in a straight line unassisted by Nurse Ratched. I don't know if Sunak enjoys being at war with Russia, although it's hard to imagine any sane human being enjoying such a predicament. I don't know if Joe Biden even knows his country is at war with Russia. Vladimir Putin of Russia surely does know he's at war with the West, but so far has opted not to strike the match that ignites the fire that consumes us all. Having a general election in Britain right now would seem like throwing a swingers party in the fast lane of a motorway in the dark, which is to say, creating a tasteless and ill-advised distraction performed by a lot of people with their trousers down and their skirts up, just to end up with the same old, the other lump of the uni-party on steroids. On the face of it, it seems especially inappropriate for anyone, politically motivated or not, who has bothered to read The Room recently. As I already mentioned, all across Europe, the latest election results make plain that vast swathes of populations have finally been pushed beyond all endurance by their globalist, would-be totalitarian overlords. Those globalists can squeak and squeal all they want about what they call the rise of the right, but the inescapable fact remains that after decades of being let down by politicians enthralled to one-world government fantasies, the regular people, the people so put upon by representatives of a uni-party bent on immiserating and then controlling every aspect of their lives, have turned to listen to those with something else to say. Welcome stuff about family, freedom, secure borders, national and local identity. The globalists have been thrown into a complete panic, increasingly a meltdown, confronted by more and more people who see them for what they are, essentially as the members of an international crime syndicate that needs forever war to survive. The dinosaurs, the old guard, have sought to silence, to ridicule, to criminalise, to vilify, and most recently to shut in their homes or to force to line up and receive unsafe and ineffective medical products. More and more common sense people who just want rid of them once and for all. Back in 2016, there were two moments when the people, the bullied, disregarded people who'd finally had enough of being either ignored or just treated with contempt by their leaders, did something those leaders weren't expecting. On one side of the Atlantic, the much-maligned so-called deplorables punched a hole in their basket and voted Donald Trump into the White House. On the other side of the same ocean, a whole other coming together of people who were supposed to sit quietly in their box voted for Brexit to take Britain out of the European Union. And after that, on account of that, well, we've had what we've had. A scamdemic, a hoax climate crisis, war in Ukraine that bears all the hallmarks of being enough to metastasize into nuclear Armageddon. How psychopathic would a bunch of losers have to be that rather than accept their jig is up, that the game is over, they would rather drag us all into the abyss with them? How ironic, amid all the talk of democracy, up to and including the lying claptrap about the war in Ukraine being about defending democracy in a country where there is none, that it was actual manifestations and products of actual democracy, Trump in the White House and Brexit for Britain, that made the totalitarians drop their masks and reveal themselves for what they are, the enemies of democracy, and to effectively declare that silly old troublesome democracy was not for the likes of you and me anyway, and that it had to be burned down and replaced with the advent of digital serfdom. Here's the thing, I say again that the world has never been more dangerous than right now, largely on account of our being cursed with so-called leaders of absolutely the lowest calibre, kakistocrats all. For whatever reason, we have the worst of men and women at the worst of times. And so it's no coincidence that it's right now that people all over the world are rejecting the choice that is no choice. All across Europe and in the United States as well, the corrupted old guard and their lackeys in the mainstream media and elsewhere would actually have us believe it really is their way or the highway. Here, they don't want you looking at anyone but them, being the last of the Conservatives and the Labour Party that hates workers. In the US, the red and blue try to pretend that other candidates of other parties simply don't exist. On both sides of the Atlantic, the incumbents behave like toddlers who believe that if they close their eyes, the thing that scares them disappears. Just vote for one of us, they still say. In blue shirts or red shirts, it makes no difference. And under absolutely no circumstances dare to contemplate those awful fascists and Nazis over there with their dangerous talk of freedom, rights and democracy. Anyway, they say, if it's Nazis you want, then offer your support and money to these proper, good old-fashioned Nazis we have over here, the ones that helped us win the Second World War against the Russians. And if that makes no sense to you, if you know the truth is literally the opposite of what we're being told, then it's because you, like so many around the world now, have woken up to recognise the truth and to remember who the bad guys actually are. I'm joined by Greg Swenson. Greg, it's been said, not by me, but by a much wiser head, that weak men create bad times. Is that where we are?
Totally. I mean, look at the picture from the G7 meeting, where, Meloni is really the only person on the stage that's not weak. And we might disagree with her on certain things like Ukraine and Russia, but, generally speaking, all of these leaders are dead men walking. I mean, they've all been either voted out of office or they're polling 30 points below the competition. So that's refreshing in many ways, though. I think we are in a sea of change. Unfortunately, we're going the other way here in the UK with Labour coming in, but it's refreshing to see reform. It's refreshing to see Nigel, and same in the US. It's refreshing to see that people have just become fed up with the uni-party.
It's almost laughable to me that it's happening in the US, that there are attempts being made to keep anyone but Democrats or Republicans off of the ballot.
Right.
That Robert Kennedy is to be somehow made invisible. And similarly here, there's this belief, certainly in the mainstream media, that's being sort of inculcated that well, don't look at anyone but Tory or Labour. Right. Just vote for the establishment.
And that's, the system really protects the two parties in the US. It's probably a little less so here in the UK. But I think what you found with Trump was that he was getting pushback from the party as much as he was from the Democrats. So, he was really a rebel and in many ways, obviously, a disruptor. But, they tried their best to keep him down. Biden did the same thing, or the Democrats in power have done the same thing more recently by keeping RFK Jr. out of the process. And good for him that he went independent because he couldn't get a fair shot. They literally kept him off the ballot in Florida and North Carolina, the same way they tried to get Trump off the ballot in several states. So it's and I find it amusing when they claim that we have to protect democracy, don't elect Donald Trump, it'll be the end of democracy. They love that line, and yet they're undermining democracy and the Constitution with every chance to have. By any means necessary, that's how they operate.
Do you think if Trump gets in this time around, do you think he'll be better equipped in terms of experience properly to handle the swamp?
Completely. Look, he came in 2016 as a complete outsider. He hadn't been to Washington for more than a night or two in his life. It's different than Westminster, where everybody's kind of dialed in. The finance people and the political people and the media people. Everybody's in a little bubble here. In the U.S., Wall Street people like me never went to Washington. I think I'd been there twice before 2018. And so it's completely different. And Washington people wouldn't know what to do in New York City. But, he went down there guns a-blazing in 2016, but in many ways unprepared. And he didn't have the infrastructure. He hadn't been there before. He didn't have the team. Obama brought his Chicago team. Reagan brought the California gang, right? It's different this time. He's much more disciplined. He's still going to be crazy and loud and say funny things and be a disruptor. But he's much more disciplined. I've been told that about the campaign, even from Democrats who are surprisingly impressed with his discipline and order. But he's got a team. And, this Heritage 25 project, they're putting together a think tank. They're prepared. And I think you'll see the swamp be semi-drained.
Interesting indeed. First break of the evening, after which I'll be joined by ex-Olympian and former Conservative candidate Alex Storey to talk all things general election. You're watching The Neil Oliver Show on GB News. Welcome back to The Neil Oliver Show. My first guest this week is Alex Storey. Alex is a former rower for Team GB who turned his hand to politics once he left sport, once standing as a Conservative candidate. Alex, it's good to see you.
Good to see you as well. Can you hear me?
I can indeed. A general election looms once again. I am dripping with cynicism about the process and about the worth of going through it. What say you?
Well, I find myself in the same category, and it's quite heartbreaking in a way, because when I was an athlete, I really felt that representing one's people in anything, whether it was sports or in politics, was perhaps one of the noblest things that you could potentially do. And that's why I spent years campaigning for what I thought was a worthy cause. And it's really the course of time and all the various things that we've seen, in particular over the last 14 years, that have completely stripped my enthusiasm for the process and have put me in the camp of Neil Oliver and all sorts of other people like that. Because in the end, you realize that you get lots of, the whole thing is the theater of it, which is you raise people's hopes, you tell people that something might be possible and achievable if only they could give you their support. And eventually, when they get into power, they just sit in their offices. It's a different team with a different color tie, but actually all the policies are all the same. And this repeated lie and deception really drips, or at least acts like a corrosive on your sense of political duty in a way, and it's very sad.
I wonder if proof were needed of the reality of what we've learned to call the uni-party isn't laid bare by the apparent determination of the establishment and their allies in the mainstream media to exile and exclude anyone but the establishment parties from, say, the leadership debates. We're being invited to pretend that there almost literally is nothing to do but vote either Conservative or Labour.
Well, yeah, because the machine is obsolete in many ways, and it's only programmed to deal with the politics as it has grown in the way that it has grown up. That's the issue at the moment. And I think we are in a revolutionary period where we have two of the main parties who have leaders with no credibility. I mean, Sunak is the only person who lost his way to Downing Street, and Keir Starmer still trying to gauge what he stands for. And then from below, there is an enormous cohort of people, perhaps, let's say, 46 or 47% of the population that really don't know who to back. And this is this moment where I'm thinking, well, perhaps this election is worth paying attention to, because the old establishment is creaking. It still thinks that it should be in positions of power. It should be in office. There should be no competition to their supreme right to rule. And then on the facts on the streets, you see is something very different happening. And that's perhaps the reason why we should take a closer look at what's happening and the developments. And it could happen very quickly. I mean, we should not forget what happened a few years back when the Scottish Labour Party completely disappeared. Now, granted, England is a bigger place with more seats and a larger population, but things like that are possible. My only fear is, if that's possible, and if something interesting does happen, what will the establishment do? And my default setting now is probably close to yours as well, is if the state realizes that it's being challenged by democracy, it will kill democracy. And that's my worry about the whole project, or the whole prospects of this election.
Greg Swenson, that's an interesting thought. The swamp here would move to suffocate democracy itself if they haven't already done so.
Yeah, they're trying their best. And, you mentioned you were dripping with cynicism. I was dripping with boredom because, it was the most unexciting election with obviously Labour winning. And that's why until last Monday when Nigel and Reform had their big announcement. So, look, I think there's hope there because there was no party of the right. And you're seeing the rest of Europe move to parties of the right. And when I say parties of the right, they are actually conservative. And so, whereas here, the Tory party for 14 years has been at best a center-right party, but more of just a uni-party. And who could have dreamed of price caps and windfall taxes and fracking bans and net zero? Joe Biden and the left can only dream of accomplishing that in the U.S., and yet the so-called party of the right here in the U.K. has done that and accomplished those things. So there's time for change.
Alex, we're trapped almost, I think, in this use of the vocabulary of left and right. Is it helpful, perhaps, to think of what's happening elsewhere in Europe, as evidenced by the surge of alternative voting in Europe? Is it a rise of? I refuse to see populist as a pejorative, but is it a surge of the people against the establishment, which it would appear that both Labour and Tory have just ossified into?
And we can also go beyond Europe and still celebrate democracy, in particular in El Salvador. I think Bukele is a very interesting character, and I was listening to one of his interview, very long form interview, which are sometimes the most interesting. And he said, we were the most violent country in the world. We were the murder capital of the entire world, and in the space of a year and a half, we became the most peaceful. And it was extremely easy. It was tough. We took some tough decisions, but it was very cheap, and we managed, with the help of the supreme being, as he called it, to resolve the issue, and at a very low cost in terms of human lives. He said they only lost 6 to 8 soldiers in the whole process of putting 70,000 gang members into prison. And the one thing that he said, which shocked me because it's so obvious, he said, democracy is really easy when you think about serving your people. Now, what that means and what it implies is that a lot of our political animals are experts who try to implement a plan from above. When you try to implement a plan from above, by definition, you have to fight against what your own people want, because they want local problems to be fixed. They're not really concerned about global issues. What they want is their immediate cities and towns and counties to be safe, to be clean, jobs to be available. What they're not really concerned about is global plans. And this is really the thing that Bukele just talks about. It's this fight between the plan from above by an elite few who've decided that they know what's right for you, and the people at the bottom saying, well, actually, that's completely against my own interest. This is the fight. There are some countries that have had the good fortune of backing and having leaders like Bukele. The only thing is, can we do this in Britain? Can we do this across Europe?
Have to jump in there, Alex, only because of time. But I appreciate the optimism of all that you're saying there, and I don't think anyone with an honest heart can seek to defy the will of people, honest, common sense people everywhere. Alex Storey, thanks so much for your contribution this evening. It's another break. After that, I'll be continuing this discussion with GBNews senior political commentator Nigel Nelson. You're watching The Neil Oliver Show on GB News. Welcome back to The Neil Oliver Show. They always say take polls with a pinch of salt, so here goes. But this week, one poll put Reform above the Conservatives as being the most likely challenger to Labour. Another claimed that as many as 1 in 3 voters are yet to decide who they will back in July. So with that in mind, let's get the latest thoughts from GBNews senior political commentator Nigel Nelson. Thanks for joining us, Nigel. Should we continue to have faith in the democratic process in this Great Britain of ours?
Yeah, I think so, on the basis that you get to choose your government once every 4 or 5 years. And I think it's a good idea to go out and do just that. So if you are a party enthusiast for one party or the other, then you can choose what you think is going to be the best next government. If you're not an enthusiast, you can choose the least worst.
Persuade me, if you will, that there is any choice. I feel it's very much like when Henry Ford said you can have any colour you want as long as it's black when it came to his cars. I feel that the two parties, like the pigs and the farmers in Animal Farm, have become indistinguishable from one another, so that the loud question has to be, how do you choose?
I think you choose by looking at the manifestos. If you've got time, I would suggest that everybody reads through the manifestos and sees which party is putting forward policies that are A, in their best interests, and B, best accrue with their particular views. So that's the first thing. If you haven't got time to look at the entire manifestos, they're quite long. Right at the end, there's a costings, which is the key. Is what the parties are putting forward affordable? Does it make sense? They're actually quite simple. They're not. You don't have to have a mathematics degree to understand these things, but you can have a look at that and say, yeah, that seems to make sense. I think that party has got the most realistic policy.
I have to say, Nigel, I find it amazing that you continue, and you're entitled so to do, to have faith in manifestos and to consider policies as though even if policies are even desirable, that they are ever enacted. But I would say to you, I would ask you, when you look back at the last 4 years, when we came through the COVID era, I would say everyone involved, Tory, Labour, Liberals, SNP, they were catastrophic. They were shamefully negligent. They've caused economic disaster. Their policies regarding the so-called vaccines led to death and harms for legions of people. There was all sorts of inappropriate behaviour that went on, let's say. And as far as I'm concerned, all of those people, every last one of them from those front benches, should have walked away with their heads hanging in shame, never to take public office again. And yet, there they all are, the guilty men and women, seeking re-election. Persuade me otherwise. OK. Well, I mean,
first of all, at the last election we had in 2019, no one had a policy for COVID because we didn't know COVID was around the corner. Now we've been through that. I think
did have a policy in as much as the World Health Organization's pandemic preparedness plan was already there. Everything was thrown up in the air. So there were policies about how such an event, if it actually happened, was to be handled.
And we were ill prepared for it. I mean, quite clearly we were ill prepared. Obviously, we didn't have enough PPE, and so it went on. Not enough ventilators. So I think that one has to actually expect, when you see a manifesto, what it's giving you is if everything goes right. What it's not giving you is what might happen if things go wrong. So we've had a number of shocks to the political system in this country. COVID, obviously, being the major one. The war in Ukraine is another one. One that was self-inflicted, which was Brexit, which we're still trying to sort out.
What, self-inflicted in as much as most people in Britain voted for it?
No, self-inflicted in the sense that we chose to do it. I mean, we didn't choose COVID. We didn't choose the war in Ukraine. It wasn't a comment about Brexit, whether it's right or wrong. But we did actually go out there and choose to have a vote on Brexit. And it was always going to be incredibly complicated. We're still going through the consequences of it now. All I'm saying is these are big events. There was a big constitutional change, probably the biggest since the Reformation. So we had to go through those things, and that does knock manifestos out. So don't take a manifesto as this is certain. Take the manifesto as this is what they're going to try and do, and they do take them seriously, by the way. This is what they're going to try and do if they possibly can.
Greg, I feel that what Nigel is saying sounds like listening to commentary from another time. Having watched what happened during the last 4 years,
Sure.
the incompetence at best, if not downright malevolence, what do you feel about this, the guilty people?
Yeah, it's pretty outrageous.
Still being there.
I think it's pretty outrageous, and I think Bev Turner said a lot of really important things on this, that there's got to be some repercussions. There's got to be some, Matt Hancock tried his best to disappear, but there were so many mistakes made, but mistakes are one thing, but if you're willfully lying to the people, then you should be punished for that. At the very least, you should be punished by not holding office if you're deliberately lying to the people. They knew that there was no science to support a lot of the stuff that they did, and they did it anyway, because maybe they like power, maybe they like to control people, but this is
Do you call it a lie?
So much of it was, so much of it was deliberate. And,
I call it a lie.
I mean, look at the WhatsApps from Matt Hancock. He knew that this stuff wasn't going to work, these things that he was doing. And same in the U.S. with Fauci. And, he just testified a few weeks ago. It was probably humiliating for him, but he deserves it. He deserves to be humiliated. And, he knew that 6 feet was just not a thing. He knew that masks didn't work. He knew that locking down schools and making children wear masks was cruel and inhumane. So, there should be repercussions for that, and it's a shame. And it's also one of the flaws of the two-party system that becomes the uni-party system. You need a disruptor once in a while. Ronald Reagan was a disruptor. They didn't like him in the mainstream.
With that in mind, Nigel, what about the fact that there's this concerted effort to make sure that Nigel Farage, whatever your opinions are about Nigel Farage as an individual and as a politician, ought not to take part in these in leadership debates? Why this determination to pretend he's not there when plainly people here and across Europe, people are interested to hear what so-called popular or populist
Nigel Farage has taken part in the last two.
Not being recognised as a leader, though.
Well, yes, he has been. I mean, we're talking about a system in which, in this country, and obviously in the States, in which we have two main parties. So when Rishi Sunak says that either he or Keir Starmer will be Prime Minister on July the 4th, that's absolutely right. One of those two will be Prime Minister. Those are the head-to-heads we want to see. Then you have the other party leaders, of which there's been two debates so far. Nigel has been at both of them.
But I say again, we're running out of time. We're being asked to choose between one party that was dreadful during COVID as leaders and another party that, had they been the leaders at the same time, would have done all of the same things, only more of it earlier, faster and longer. How can you possibly, without, as Greg says, the repercussions and account of all of that wrong, even begin to contemplate trusting either of these characters and their parties with the leadership of this country?
Well, you're absolutely right that it will come down finally to who you trust. And again, it's who you trust most or least or whatever. And that is what the voter has to decide. I think that COVID is not playing a major part in this election because although it's still with us, essentially that emergency has passed. The same way that Brexit's not playing a major part because that is done and dusted. We're not going back into Europe. So apart from the Lib Dems, nobody else is talking about that.
As far as I'm concerned, it's a choice between the cancer you've already got or turbo metastasised stage 4 cancer, and it's no choice to be offered. We've run out of time. Thank you, Nigel, for your opinions there. It's another break already. After that, Richard Sakwa will join us to take a closer look at exactly what's going on with Russia's ongoing military activity in Ukraine. You're watching The Neil Oliver Show on GB News. Welcome back to The Neil Oliver Show. US officials have played down the arrival of 4 Russian naval vessels in Cuba for military drills. They're anchored in Havana Bay, some 90 miles from the US state of Florida. The vessels, which include a nuclear-powered submarine and a frigate, are being seen by some as a show of force amid Moscow's continuing tensions with the West over the military operations in Ukraine. Meanwhile, G7 leaders have this week been engineering a new $50 billion loan to help Ukraine, funded by the interest earned on profits from Russia's frozen central bank assets. Joining me to consider all of this and to give his take on the situation is political scientist and former professor of Russian and European politics at the University of Kent, Richard Sakwa. Thank you for joining us, Professor.
My pleasure.
Now, Professor, are Britain and the United States already at war with Russia or not?
Well, not at war as such, of course, but we're moving that way. The Russo-Ukrainian war is gradually becoming a NATO-Russia war, and the UK and the United States and Germany and France, of course, in the lead of that, and of course Italy. So it's widening, and of course this was always a danger. Initially, Biden tried to avoid that by placing limitations on the use of weapons supplied to Ukraine. But as we've seen, more and more of these lines are being moved, including giving permission to use these weapons inside Russia itself.
It's my contention that we have the worst of leaders at the most dangerous of times, certainly in Europe, certainly in the West. As you say, the Russians are in Cuba. There are American ATACMS in Ukraine. What could possibly go wrong? At what point does some sort of wise head in the room contemplate de-escalation instead of continually turning up the heat?
Absolutely. Everything could go wrong. It's very dangerous. Compared to the Cuban Missile Crisis, when there were very wise leadership, obviously John Kennedy and his team, compared to that time, which they managed to negotiate and manage a dangerous crisis, at this point, we have no one in the West showing any serious leadership qualities. Macron in France is escalating. The United Kingdom, as always, seems to have no limits and is pushing and pushing and pushing this Cold War up the foothills of the Third World War. And of course, in Germany, we have the Foreign Minister, Baerbock, and others also militantly. In other words, they are suggesting that Russia is bluffing when it threatens response, some sort of asymmetrical response. And of course, when Russia doesn't do anything, they say, well, it's just a bluff. Well, Russia, as some of their commentators there say, they're bluffing until they're no longer bluffing. And his visit to Cuba is a sign of the fact that this war is escalating into possibly elements, as I say, it's the foothills of the Third World War at this moment in time. So far, the foothills, but we're going up that mountain quite fast.
Greg Swenson, no wisdom in the West. No. What hope is there? I mean, are we dependent, actually, contrary to the way in which he's generally perceived or presented in the West, are we dependent upon Putin being the calm head in the room?
Ironically, that might be the case when you look at Biden, you look at Macron. You know, Biden is hopeless, and he's yes, at the beginning of the war, he was trying to use some kind of restraint on the weapons and how the weapons can be used. But it's been basically incrementalism. Doesn't help anybody when he puts the handcuffs. And to add a real dose of cynicism here, the reason he didn't want the Ukrainians to fire into Russia and damage oil refineries or oil production is because he didn't want oil prices to go up. His war on energy in the U.S. really has caused the escalation in oil prices and natural gas prices. It wasn't Russia invading Ukraine. It was Biden's war on energy and reckless spending that caused inflation, which naturally raises oil prices. So he was very much against the use of weapons. So, you know, whether you agree with it or not, the reality is it wasn't saving lives or preventing more carnage. It was oil prices.
Professor Sakwa, was it ever legitimate to call Putin's invasion unprovoked? Was that ever the case?
No, it was. This is perhaps one of the most provoked wars of our times. We can go all the way back to NATO enlargement and then specific actions in 2020, 2021. Of course, the enforced or coercive regime change in Ukraine in 2014, and so on. And of course, the fact that Russia's security concerns were never taken into account, as if they didn't matter. So this war, this idea of unprovoked. On the other hand, of course, when you're provoked, you don't always have to react. And so there's ways and different ways of handling it. But certainly the war was massively provoked, including, of course, the HMS Defender incident in March 2021, which people tell me absolutely enraged Putin when the ship entered into Russian waters around Crimea.
It's interesting, is it not, Professor Sakwa, that if the shoe was on the other foot, if you were to consider, for example, the Monroe Doctrine, and America's determination that nobody messes with the Western Hemisphere, what would have been the reaction of the US had Russia, or indeed China, embarked upon a programme of planting a hostile presence in Central America?
Yeah, we know what the response would have been because we saw it in Cuba in October 1962, when the response was absolutely robust. This is not allowed, and so what we've had is a sort of a universal Monroe Doctrine where Russia's security interests we're not even talking about a sphere of interest. We're talking about a sphere of security, and of course. What's happened is that the situation became exacerbated and finally exploded in 2022.
Greg, it's my contention that the whole world, and certainly the likes of Macron and Sunak and the rest, they urgently need a history lesson. A relatively recent contemporary history lesson, perhaps going no further back than 2014, but certainly we should all be paying attention to what happened in 1962.
Absolutely, and if you look at what happened later, in between, in the late 70s and early 80s, the deterrence factor was important. And whether or not you're for defense buildup or proxy wars, like we saw in Nicaragua and El Salvador at the time, there was a massive defense buildup with the intention of never firing a shot. Reagan hated nuclear weapons. He hated them more than anything. And yet he realized that there had to be an economic expansion to support this. There had to be a defense spending expansion. And there were no wars. And it worked. Now, I think Putin is looking at Biden right now and saying, here's a president, not only is he senile, but he's cut defense spending in the United States 3 years in a row by 3%. You have defense spending at 2.9%. It's the lowest since 1999, which is a very peaceful time, and we were still enjoying the peace dividend. So now you have 2.9%. If Biden were to win, it would be at 2.4% by 2034. This is troubling for the world and for NATO.
Troubling for the world and for NATO. Indeed it is. Thank you, Greg, for those comments there. Thank you, Professor Richard Sakwa, for joining us this evening. Time is against us. I hope we can pick up this conversation in another time and place. That's it for the Neil Oliver Show on GB News this week. There's plenty more, though, online, where I'll be continuing to discuss the rise of right-wing or popular parties across Europe. And as discussions continue around online harms, would a phone-free childhood be a good idea? So thanks again, Greg Swenson. Good evening and welcome along to the second hour of the Neil Oliver Show, where I have a chance at least, to have a longer and more in-depth chat with my guests. Lets the whole thing take a breath. Tonight I'll be continuing my discussion on the war in Ukraine with former senior military intelligence officer Philip Ingram. I'll then be looking at the online safety bill that bedevils us everywhere we turn and asking whether it goes far enough to protect children from harmful content. And finally, we'll be taking a look at what is going on across the water in the European elections. Joining me for the next hour, as he was here before, is Chairman of Republicans Overseas, Greg Swenson. Thanks for being here. My first guest in this second hour of the show is former Senior Military Intelligence Officer Philip Ingram. Welcome, Professor, and thank you for joining me.
Good afternoon.
In what sense, Professor, is it fair to describe the Russian action in Ukraine as having been unprovoked?
The Russian action in Ukraine unprovoked. Well, first of all, I'm not a professor, so I'm a former colonel in British military intelligence.
I do beg your pardon, sir.
No, that's not a problem at all. It depends on what way you're looking at things. Vladimir Putin was looking for an excuse to try and send a message to the West around NATO expansionism, because there is this belief in Russia that NATO is this body that is there to threaten Russia. And they're paranoid about it, whereas there's a complete failure to understand that NATO doesn't have an expansionist policy. It doesn't go out advertising and trying to find new countries to join it. It's an alliance, a defensive alliance that allows sovereign nations to apply to join it, and if they meet the political and military criteria, then and every member of NATO agrees, then they can join it. Putin has been concerned that the creep of NATO into the east over the years since the fall of the Cold War, since the collapse of the Cold War and the fall of the Berlin Wall, he's seen that as a threat. He's dressed it up as a threat to Russia, but it's really a threat to his desire to regenerate the old Soviet Union as it was, with him as effectively the president or the head of the alliance as it was. And he's trying to hark back to the past, and he's dreamt this up as an excuse as to a reason why he should go in and attack Ukraine, to create a buffer zone and create a country a bit like he has with his puppet country in Belarus.
I hear what you're saying about, I'll give the devil his due then that NATO doesn't have an expansionist policy, let's say. However, Russia was invited to think at the end of the Cold War and with the fall of the Iron Curtain that there would be no expansion in his direction. But however it happened, NATO territory has crept 1,000 miles closer to him and to the Federation than it was then. And then there have been multiple steps along the way that look a lot less innocent than that. What happened in 2014, what happened in Maidan, what happened with the coup that was pushed by Victoria Nuland. Surely it's difficult to contend that NATO and the US are innocent in this, and that all of this happened just while they weren't watching.
Well, what people don't realise is, Russia was getting closer to NATO. Russia was not seen as, after the collapse of the Cold War, was not seen as an enemy anymore. It was seen as, a country that we could start to do business with, which is why our security services took their eye off the ball with regard to Russian espionage and elsewhere. And we had a sort of an entente cordiale building up with Russia. The Russians had a military mission inside NATO headquarters. The Russians participated in NATO-led operations. If we look at Kosovo, we remember the incident where the Russians sent a formation into Pristina in Kosovo, and it arrived 24 hours before the NATO forces went in, and the NATO Supreme Commander Wes Clark tried to order the British commander on the ground to stop the Russians by all means. Well, the British commander on the ground turned around and said, "No, I'm not starting Third World War. They're coming to join my force." And they came in and they contributed. So we were working together in many more ways. And Russia was in a position to understand much more about what NATO was doing, where it was going, and it was learning from it itself. And Vladimir Putin didn't like that, though. He continued to try and push it as a threat. And we have to remember that his motivation is a degree of political dominance, but underpinned and enabled by criminal dominance. Russia has got its governmental structures that are there. Putin has changed those over the years to turn that into a dictatorship, which has him in effectively for life. And it's controlled by a series of huge business empires headed by oligarchs that control everything that there is going on around Russia. The oligarch in chief that enables them to get away with everything that they're doing is Vladimir Putin. He's the one that allows them to the law enforcement to turn a blind eye to a lot of the illegal activities that have gone on, allows them to cement themselves in their particular business areas and cream off the profits. And Russia is suffering from that from a military perspective today.
Greg Swenson, would you call that fair comment? I would suggest perhaps that it's oligarchs everywhere you look. In the West as well as in the East, and you've only got to look back at what Vice President Joe Biden was bragging about in relation to how he was almost, it would appear, dominating Ukraine as a personal fiefdom. Telling the government or the regime, who they could and couldn't have as prosecutors. But is NATO and the West innocent in all of this?
We're not perfect, and I think I'm always cautious about moral relativism and saying, well, yeah, but Zelensky's bad or the other countries are bad. Yes, Joe Biden is compromised. There's no doubt about it. Are Republican presidents perfect? Of course not. But it's clear that Biden was compromised. They should have had someone else in control there. Hunter Biden shouldn't have been getting paid by Burisma for an obscene amount of money, putting Vice President Biden in that compromised position. But, they've been paid by China, Russia, Ukraine, Kazakhstan, Romania. They're compromised, no doubt. So I wouldn't say that the U.S. is perfect, but I'm cautious about saying that, yeah, we all do it. I think Russia's the bad guy here. I think I can agree with that.
Philip Ingram, is it wise, given that Russia has warships in Havana Bay, is it wise in that context that there are ATACMS, serious ordnance in Ukraine, and increasing tendency towards suggesting that Ukraine might do with those weapons, those ballistic weapons, whatever it wants? Surely there comes a point where wiser heads must prevail.
Well, the wiser head is to give the Ukrainians the wherewithal to defeat the Russians as quickly as is physically possible. The Russian warships in Havana bear little to zero threat to the United States or anything else. There will be enough capability in close enough proximity to monitor and to react to anything that they may try and do from an aggressive perspective. I'm being very careful in what I say here. The Russians are doing it to try and suggest to the Russian people and to some of their friends around the world that they're still a global power, and they are going about that sort of business. Putin will be trying to see where he can get more global dollars from and set up alliances where he can get more weapons from. His weapons situation is such that he's now relying on North Korea and Iran to supply him ammunition. That's not a good position to be in, and therefore, he's trying to play a very careful game here. The weapons that are inside Ukraine, the ATACMS and the other capabilities that are there, are not sufficient at the moment to give Ukraine the wherewithal to defeat Vladimir Putin. But the only way that this conflict is going to stop anytime soon is when Putin is defeated. And if he's not defeated, the potential is that it will stimulate other dictators around the world to go, okay, so we can go and take a piece of territory by force, and we just have to ride out the bow wave of the West for 3 to 5 years, and then they'll acquiesce and let us keep what we've got. That is a very, very, very dangerous message to send to other nations around the world.
Philip Ingram, time is against me. I'll have to let you go on that final point. Thank you for joining me this evening.
Thank you.
With me tonight, and a very welcome presence he is too, is Chairman of Republicans Abroad, Greg Swenson. Greg, we were listening there to Philip Ingram, and I ran out of time with him, but his final point there about the necessity for Ukraine to defeat Russia, I felt we couldn't just leave that where it was. So can I ask you, is that in any way realistic that Ukraine might beat Russia? Isn't Ukraine a dead man walking?
Whether you're on one side or the other, it's it can't be done without a lot more support. And you're seeing that incrementalism, right? So again, without choosing whether we should escalate or not, Biden and even Boris at the beginning Boris was much more aggressive, sending arms right away. Biden was very hesitant. Now, you can say that was because he didn't want to escalate, he didn't want to provoke Putin, but, choose your poison, right? Incrementalism doesn't work in war. Not giving them F-16s when that's what they needed, not giving them Abrams tanks when they needed them. So from a tactical perspective, either do it or don't. But if this incrementalism isn't going to work, so I think he's right in that that Ukraine could win, but they can't win like this. So then you just have stalemate, which is just death and destruction.
Having done everything in their power to provoke what happened, having taken their own part in that provocation, and after all this time and 500,000 dead,
right.
to still be talking as though victory for Ukraine is achievable without simply pressing the red button for World War III.
Yeah,
it seems beyond countenance.
And that's the problem. It's a hypothetical. Can they win? I mean, I don't know that that's the only outcome. He said that's the best outcome, but that's not the only outcome. And I think this is worrisome because you don't want to escalate. But on the other hand, NATO, you probably laugh when I say this, but NATO is a liberator, not an occupier. It is a defensive alliance. So I think some of that provocation argument is a little bit aggressive.
I think the only outcome is more laundered billions and more dead men and boys, I have to say.
It's unfortunate. Yeah.
However, we have to move on. We are moving on. Campaigners are warning that millions of under-13s will be exposed to harmful internet online content, despite the latest crackdown by the online watchdog. I'm joined now by Arabella Hastie from the campaign group Us For Them to discuss this further. Thanks for making time for us.
Thank you, Neil.
I looked in the notes. 60% of 8 to 11-year-olds have social media profiles, which equates to 1.6 million children in the UK, and a third of 5 to 7s use social media unsupervised. How concerned, how vulnerable, how much of a worry is all of this?
It's a huge worry, Neil. And one of the reasons that Us For Them got into this is because our parents, post the pandemic, were particularly concerned about the impact of screen time on their children and the fact that they were forced to increase the usage of screens. And we started to do a lot of looking into this. And the more we looked into it, the more worried we got. Those numbers you gave are terrifying. The fact that a quarter of 3 to 4-year-olds have their own smartphone, which is quite incredible. And that's jumped in the last year. So this is getting worse. But more importantly is when you start looking at this, it's not just the social media, which is horrific, and the amount of things they're doing and that they're trying to find on it, but it's also the other levels of harm that they're getting. These devices are addictive, and they're addictive by design. They're designed to suck up our attention, and they're designed to make us use them longer. And it's hard enough as an adult to manage that, but for a child, it's almost impossible. When you're asking to do it. And then when you look at the individual harms that come from this, language in young children, which we already know was a real problem post-pandemic because children weren't socialised, young children weren't socialised, they were seeing people in masks. But now we know that for every minute a child at 3 spends on screen time, they hear 6 fewer adult words and make 5 fewer vocalisations to a child who's not seeing that. That has enormous knock-on effect when children are developing and growing up.
Bill, I hear that, and as a parent, my children are older than that now, but I absolutely empathise with what you're saying. However, you would have to say that a 3 to 4-year-old has a smartphone in their hands. They didn't walk into the mobile phone shop and acquire that for themselves. It's been put into their hands by somebody who, quite frankly, ought to know better in many instances. So, to what extent do we need to balance absolute concerns with? Does this open a door that, on the pretext I would offer of protecting children, it gives authority and the establishment just yet more grounds to censor and silence other content that they just don't want being available to people? How do you balance it? Should parents not just be taking phones away from kids?
And absolutely, Neil, you've hit on a really important point. Part of the problem is that as parents, it's almost impossible to manage this by yourself. You're absolutely right. 3, 4, 5-year-olds, you can. You shouldn't be letting your children have it. You shouldn't give them time there. But when you're talking teenagers, this is really difficult because it's very different to, I've got an older child and I've got a slightly younger child. The world has changed in the 5 years between those two children. And if you don't have a smartphone, you are not part of the playground. You're not involved in conversations. Therefore, it's something that we need to have collective action to actually engage and do. But you're absolutely right. There is a real concern that if we, around content, and I know this is a huge concern around the Online Safety Act when it went through about things like harmful and illegal and elements there. The real sadness is we have an Online Safety Act that actually doesn't do what it was intended to do. We, us, then, were always concerned that it was not going to deliver in protecting children. And Ofcom have made it clear that it actually won't deliver, which is one of the reasons that we proposed different solutions around the smartphones and licensing regime rather than through the Online Safety Act, which is going to fail because it doesn't deliver enough for what we need it to do. Greg
Swenson, what is the balance here? You know, I think we all as parents, you can all understand the threat that's posed, all sorts of things, you know, those sites that were pushing, you know, ways to suicide, you know, things about, you know, unhealthy weight loss, all of the opportunities for cyberbullying and all the rest of it. But, you know, at what point is it just down to parents and schools saying, you can't have a phone?
Absolutely.
Not in here.
And I think it could start at the local level. Schools should definitely take charge on that because it's difficult for parents to ask their children to skip the cell phone or not get a smartphone when all of their friends have it. As Bella pointed out, it's really difficult. This is peer pressure. And, you know, again, I think we're lucky because our kids kind of missed that and didn't have, you know, mine probably didn't have a smartphone until high school. But, you know, even then, it was a complete and utter waste of time and a distraction, you know, with some practical uses. But I think there has to be some collusion. So I'm very much against government top-down regulation, but there are occasions where you have to say, we need anybody and everybody to stop this insanity.
Bella, in order to find that always aspire to middle path between the two extremes, between, you know, censorship and 3 and 4-year-olds with smartphones, what does for them? What if you had the levers of power at Ofcom in terms of the Ombudsman? What would you do?
Yes. Well, first of all, we don't think the Online Safety Act is fit for purpose. They always put far too much emphasis on age verification without any ability to actually deliver it. They've now admitted they don't have the ability to deliver it and do it in a way, and therefore they're actually not putting any pressure on the tech companies to deliver it. So they have certain ages, they say 13, but there's no way of them actually making sure that happens. They talk about the fact that they won't let children see that harmful input, but without any level of, you know, age verification, which we never thought was going to work anyway, that won't, you know, they won't be able to check that. And therefore you'll have all those issues that we were talking about and the anxiety and the self-harm and all of those things that come through. So we believe that what we should be looking at is a licensing regime that looks at promoting restricted smartphones for children or restricted phones for children. The dumb phone is, you know, an old flip phone. It doesn't have enough on it. Society has changed. But if we could have phones that actually still have GPS, that still have maps, that still have the utilities, that still have the key things that children need to be able to get around, and that parents can find them and parents can talk to them. But you take off the social media, you take off the internet in your pocket. And it's the personalisation of having a little phone in your pocket, the internet there on all the time, means that children are getting notifications constantly. They're obsessed with their hits and people being there. And it also is a huge problem for grooming and all these awful issues. You know, something like 130,000 of the self-generated child sexual abuse materials last year were made by 11 to 13-year-old girls in their bedrooms, you know, because they can do that in private. And as a parent, it's quite hard to keep an eye and check on that. Parental controls don't work because it's a full-time job and children are more sophisticated than parents in getting around there. But we believe you need to get down to the smartphone, the actual phone itself, and give other options for people. But as your contributor said, it's got to be in schools as well. Schools should not be having homework apps. You know, it's very hard as a parent.
There's something I would say, Bill. I'm listening to this, listening to Greg. I hold my hand up and say I'm as manacled to these infernal devices as anybody. You know, as my children would testify, because they're always after me about how much time I'm spending on my phone, and it does break my heart, quite frankly. You know, I stand on a railway platform or I sit on a plane, and you see everyone in that familiar posture with their heads down. Yes. And every single human being, young and old, is paying all of their attention to this little bit of plastic in their hand. And you talk about society has changed. You know, I suppose on a more philosophical note, should we just surrender to this brainwashing that we are all experiencing?
No, I don't. Absolutely, we shouldn't. And I think it's happened so fast that I don't think any of us realised it was happening. It's only 2012 that smartphones really kicked in with this kind of level of sophistication. And algorithms came in sort of 2015, 2016. And we as adults and parents do need to make a difference, because our children mirror and mimic us. And if we're sitting there all the time, of course they're going to. And we're giving them a message that they're not as important to us as the phone in a pocket and what we're seeing. So absolutely, as adults, we need to change our behaviour. We think of them very much as experience blockers, because what you're seeing is, particularly with children, the time they're spending on these phones is time they could be doing something else. And when they take them away from children and they do detoxes, children say things like, oh, I found it really hard. However, I started drawing, or I started reading, or I went over and saw a friend, things they're just not doing. And we saw the National Literary Trust said we're actually down at the lowest level of reading for pleasure that we've ever had. And it's all these kind of going out into nature, going and knocking on the door and seeing if your friend's around, just being out and about, that you don't do if you're sitting doom scrolling on TikTok.
Oh, I couldn't agree more, Bella. Thanks so much for joining me this evening.
Thank you for having us.
To be quite honest, though, you've only made me more anxious about smartphones than I already was. Greg, sometimes I think that it's a bit like in years to come, it'll be like Hogarth's illustrations of Gin Lane. You know, when there was that period when the entire nation of England became addicted to drinking gin. Yeah. Until action was taken to prevent it. I feel that we're in the next national addiction that's as harmful in its own way. And
Bella had made some fantastic points, and it's 10 years later now, 12 years later, and only in the last few years have we really found or discovered how destructive that they are. They're destructive to us, but they're especially destructive to children. And they'd be better off going phone-free, check in on day one at school, and you maybe, get a phone when you're 20. They do it with alcohol. They do it with driving. They should do it with
all
phones.
All of us.
It doesn't sound very libertarian of me, but you can't drive a car until you're
It's not about wanting to censure or to take away or to ban. It's just that we all ought to have more to live for than the content that's coming at us out of these little plastic rectangles in our hands. The first children who were given smartphones in primary school are now adults. Some of those that Bella was talking about there. But what impact is this having on their mental health? Joining me next is Hannah Ortal, the founder of Delay Smartphones, an organisation set up to discourage parents from giving out phones to children too early. Hannah Ortal joins me now. Thank you for joining us this evening, Hannah.
Hi, thank you for having me.
This is a topic that absolutely fascinates and preoccupies me. I was saying to a previous guest, I watch everyone, out in the street, sitting on planes, sitting on trains, standing on platforms, everyone in the same, frankly depressing posture, heads down, rounded shoulders. But it's when you contemplate the fact that the youngest among us have also gone through this process of becoming addicted. What can you tell us about what has been the effect on that first cohort of youngsters that found their way into smartphone world?
Yeah, so, well, quite a lot, unfortunately. And I think we have insight now that we didn't have 10 years ago. So we know that, yeah, as you said, these first children that were given smartphones in primary school are now adults. So this Generation Z. And we know this has had a huge impact on their mental health, their physical health. So as you say, with everyone looking down all the time, for adults, when our spines are fully formed, that's one thing, and we still have back and neck problems. But for children, as their spines, they are developing and they're looking down all the time, spending sometimes up to about 9-10 hours a day on their phones. And so we've got eye damage, we've got sleep issues, obesity, there's the social development problems, because we know that children are choosing online social interaction over in-person interaction, even when they're together. So Gen Z now, are really, a lot of them speaking out and saying, we wish we hadn't got smartphones so young. So we're really turning our children into tiny addicts. And I feel like we have to respect the generation that have just gone and the experience they've had, learn from our mistakes with them and do better for this generation.
Is there... You're trying to be, perhaps look on a more positive side. Is there any evidence of that generation who've had, well, I suppose, maybe unlimited access to these devices? Any of them spontaneously getting over it? Is there any evidence of trends whereby, when they get to whatever into their late teens, they don't want this man-forged manacle in their hands anymore?
Yeah, absolutely. So there are, a lot of the times when they ask university students, it's really important the age that they ask. So I know the BBC recently did a study of asking sort of, 13 to 17-year-olds, I think it was. And they said, on the whole, they said they didn't want to be without their phones. But when you ask slightly older, teenagers, sort of the 19 to 23-year-old young adults, they say, they wish that no one had social media, but they don't want it to be then the only ones without it. So there's a sort of a movement of these young adults going back to flip phones, wanting to connect again. We've seen in Amsterdam they have cafes which are phone free, where people can really connect. So I think that we are starting to see a pushback, but I think we're still in a transition stage now, and I think it's for us to learn from this research, learn from this generation, and then start to give our children alternative devices. Because I think when I was younger, there were phone boxes on every corner. I had a BT charge card and all my friends had landlines. But obviously that's a thing of the past now. And our children still need to be able to call their friends. We need to be able to get in touch with them. And so it's really looking at, well, what can we do instead that's going to keep them safe, while they're out and about, in the world and on their own, but also what's going to keep them safe, from all the harms. And I think it's really looking at, well, what is a phone? And at the moment, what a smartphone is just a tiny computer, as Bella was just saying, whereas a real phone is what we want to be giving our children, where they can have real conversations with their real friends and not strangers on the internet.
Greg, it's almost a philosophical challenge, isn't it? I find it ironic that we still call them phones. Phone means sound, which implies speech, which is, certainly with my kids, it's the last thing that they want to do with those devices is actually talk.
It's a different language, and I've seen people sitting in the same room texting each other. It's bizarre. Or maybe they're texting other people that aren't in the room. Who knows? But it's obviously something. Again, what Hannah said. Now that we have 10 years, 12 years of data, there has to be a solution here. I don't know what it is. I'm so glad that Bella and Hannah are doing the heavy lifting on this, because it's one of the great things that they can accomplish. We could talk about Ukraine and Russia, and we could talk about all the other problems. This thing is a huge problem.
We don't give it enough attention, do we, Hannah? We don't really, as Greg says, when you stack it up against the threat of thermonuclear war, it's too easy to think, oh, well, the kids are all right because they've got their phones to distract them, but it's not really necessarily true.
That's exactly it. And so I think this is one of the most important parental decisions we'll ever make, when to give your child their first smartphone. And what's happening at the moment, I'll say most parents will make, do more research on buying a new toaster than they will on, what the first phone is they're going to give their child. And so what happens is we end up with all these old iPhones and old smartphones in drawers at home that, we've upgraded from. And so our kids find them, think, oh, I'll start using this like a little iPad. And then, of course, they start going to the park on their own and the parents are like, well, let's just pop a SIM card in it. Whereas what we want parents to do is really be aware, make an informed choice, look at the research, what's actually going on. I say to parents, if you want to give your child Snap or TikTok, first download it onto your own device. Use it as a child, as your child, with their photos for a week. See what your experience is, because your experience on that app will be completely different. So what we really want is parents to just be aware of the research and be aware of the alternatives. So we're saying, like anything else in life, we do a staggered approach for children as they're learning. They don't go from nothing straight to a new Tesla. They'll first have, a little scooter, and then they'll learn to ride a bike, and then they'll get their license and probably get some rubbish old car. So I think, why are we not doing the same thing with phones? Now that we know what we know, we owe it to them, and they are going to come back and ask us, why did you give me this device? We know parental controls don't work. This is the most addictive device that's ever been created. And I find it's really inhumane to give it to our children and take them from a play-based childhood to a phone-based childhood.
It's astonishing stuff. Thanks so much, Hannah. This very idea, as you say, that we're offering, in some cases, people are offering toddlers the most addictive device that has ever besmirched the face of the earth.
That's why we called them crackberries.
Yeah, but thank you so much, Hannah. My next guest, a familiar face on the Neil Oliver Show, David Craden, joins me next. My next guest this evening is a familiar face for those familiar with the Neil Oliver Show. He is journalist and podcaster David Craden from Canada. And he joins me now to discuss, amongst other things, the online harms bill in Canada. It's lovely to see you, David. Welcome.
Oh, it's so nice to be back, Neil. Thank you for having me on.
David, I'll be quite honest with you. In these often depressing times, and I know what's going on here with censorship and silencing, I look to Canada and I think, well, Canada's even worse. which is a fairly negative place to go in search of a positive. But bring me up to date. Reassure me that it's still the case that other people have it worse than we do.
Well, the Online Harms Act is yet to have its second reading. And of course, our parliamentary system in Canada is exactly like yours in the UK. Bills require first, second, and third reading before they go to the upper house. So we've managed to keep this bill from going to second reading. The House is going to recess in a week. So I think we're going to get into the summer without a second reading of this Online Harms Act, which is good, because it ups the possibility of this bill not passing before the next election here in Canada, which is October 2025. This is the bill, of course, that's the Internet Censorship Bill, creates an Internet Censorship czar, creates another layer of bureaucracy that people can go to complain about so-called hate speech and hateful content. And it even has a thought crimes component. You can actually be held at house arrest with a bracelet on your ankle because somebody down the street thinks you might say something hateful because they just suspect you of being that sort of person. So obviously, I'm a prime candidate because I'm always saying controversial things on the air, as you would be too, Neil, if you lived in Canada. So we need to stop this bill. It's not just an affront to free speech. It's a savage attack on free speech. And it's the worst law that I've seen anywhere in the world. I mean, this is worse than anything you find in authoritarian countries, which Canada really rapidly is becoming an authoritarian country, I would say. I don't think there's any debate about that.
I could possibly, I see your three of a kind, and I'll raise you a full house in as much as Humza Yousaf, the dear departed First Minister in Scotland, saw to it that he would criminalise what people were saying in their own homes. But by which I mean that a hypothetical situation would be that, people sitting around the dinner table of an evening in their home, doors shut, curtains drawn, father says something a little bit off colour about something or other, and the child repeats it in school the following morning. A teacher, perhaps, or another child hears it, and a process of events unfolds whereby the police knock at the door to say, we have reason to believe that in here, in the privacy of your own home, you said something we don't like the sound of. So around the world, Canada absolutely included, the autocrats, the totalitarians, the whatever you want to call them, the authoritarians. There's a lockstep element to those that wish to have control over thought and speech in every place and means.
Yes, it's globalist. Australia is doing the same thing. The United States is in the same direction. But that little anecdote that you shared about life in Scotland under thought crimes there, this sounds exactly like Nazi Germany or the Soviet Union, doesn't it? Where people used to say that they only felt safe at midnight in bed because nobody was listening. Of course, somebody could be listening in the house and then report it, and you've got the police at your doorstep, as you say. So this is just a gross attack on privacy, on the sanctity of speech in the home, and it should disgust people. It really should. Not just anger. It should disgust people that any government, so-called democratic government, would try to foist this kind of nonsense on an unwilling public, and to say it's all about safety and it's all about preventing harm for children. There's already a plenitude of laws against child pornography and against revenge porn. This has nothing to do with that. This is Trudeau's obsession with keeping people's mouths shut and not opposing his regime, his dictatorship. And you can see what happens when you oppose Justin Trudeau's dictatorship. He calls out the police on you. He freezes your bank account, as the Freedom Convoy discovered when they dared to protest his COVID-19 mandates. There is severe repression. And that's the kind of man Justin Trudeau is. He is a true autocrat. A lot of people joke that his father really was Fidel Castro, and he acts like Fidel Castro quite a bit, actually.
Greg, the word disgust there was used. I listened to what David's saying, and Nazi Germany and so on. But I'm also minded of when during the Cold War in East Germany, at the height of it, it was estimated that 1 in 4 people were informers for the secret police.
Ratting on their own family.
Which implied that every family had to have an informer, in theoretically informing on the family as well as on the neighbours and everybody else. But we have to pay so much more attention now, don't we? Because apart from flesh and blood humans as informers, the technology's there to do the job as well.
Yeah, everything's recorded. And Trudeau, I totally agree with David. He might be the worst leader in a world right now where the leaders are pretty pathetic, but he's stealing the show. Starting with the truckers and the debanking. But, he doesn't have the excuse of having dementia like President Biden, right? He's just a really bad guy. I can't say enough about him. I hope I never meet him. But I can't wait for 2025 when he can be voted out.
David, it's my contention really that these people, Trudeau arguably being the worst, let's say, are motivated really primarily by fear. They are frightened people, and ultimately what they fear most of all is everyone else. They're like arachnophobes who, when confronted with a spider, however small and harmless, their first and only instinct is just to stamp on it or to hit it with a rolled up newspaper because they're terrified of something that actually poses them no threat. And I think that what we're seeing, we seem to have evolved an ecosystem where people like that have not just survived, but they have thrived and actually risen to the top of the ziggurat, so that we're being ruled over by the most frightened people on the planet.
Well, you often talk about the kleptocracy that is in place throughout much of the democratic world today, throughout Europe, the UK, and North America. And I think that's part and parcel with it. There's a high degree of incompetence that I think instills fear that people will find out. how incompetent these people are. And they don't want opposition. They cannot brook any kind of opposition because, my God, somebody is going to find out how weak I am, how intellectually vacuous I am, how laden with hypocrisy I am, what in a complete narcissistic individual I am. And that certainly describes Justin Trudeau in spades. That's exactly the sort of individual he is. He's grossly incompetent in areas. He doesn't think a budget needs ever to be balanced. He wants that a budget balances itself. And he has doubled the national debt since he has been prime minister. He spends twice as much as he takes in. I mean, that's a fact of life. The last budget did this exactly the same thing. And he just passed a capital gains tax that he claims is going to be on the very wealthy or the wealthiest Canadians, but actually it's going to affect the middle class who's trying to buy a business or sell a business or trying to sell their cottage, because it's at $250,000 and above, which is, of course, peanuts in the market today. That's not millionaire value. That's not millionaire pricing. That's a middle class pricing. He's raising the capital gains tax this month from 50% to 66.7%, meaning the state's going to take 2/3 of your gain. That's obscene. But it's another nail in the economic coffin, of course, because Canada's on the verge of a complete economic collapse, even though he loves to say we're the best in the G7, the highest credit rating. It's all nonsense, of course. These people live in delusion and fear and delusion. I think you have encapsulated it by saying the fear is the driving force, but there's delusion as the other bookend here. They live in complete delusion.
David Craden, I could listen to this indefinitely, actually, but once again, I've run out of time with you, but it's been a delight. Thank you so much for reassuring me that the way that you feel about so much that's going on in terms of censorship and silencing, I'm not a lone voice. To move on to the final topic this evening, while much of the European election reaction has focused on French President Emmanuel Macron's bombshell snap election announcement after the far-right national rally won there, parties in other countries across the EU have been considering their gains and their losses. My next guest this evening, Ralph Schollhammer, joins me to discuss the matter further. Always a pleasure to see you, Ralph.
Great to be on with you, Neil. I think we should make this a weekly thing. I mean, we already do it basically, so it's great to be on.
Absolutely. I can't get enough of your input and insight. Wise man that you are. I've seen this. I think I've seen you describing a shift to the right across Europe. Is the revolution here, or is it a revolution still to come?
Well, that's my favorite comparison is think about an ocean liner that is moving towards an iceberg. And I think now everybody has realized, or a significant number of people on board have realized we need to change course. So you have now this ocean liner, who squeakingly, slowly tries to turn away from the iceberg and changing course. I think it's a little bit too soon whether or not we're going to make it or if we're still going to crash into the iceberg. But at least there is a waking up, let's say, of the people. I think there could have been more. I was not disappointed. I was hoping for more, I freely admit it. But I think we move in the right direction. The big irony, which I think is interesting for viewers and listeners, is so while now continental Europe is moving towards the right and is kind of moving into the direction of the original Brexiteers, it seems that Brexit Britain is hellbound to move in the exact opposite direction in the upcoming elections on July 4th. So that's a very ironic turn, I find.
It is. I mentioned it myself in my opening remarks at the top of the show, Ralph, in as much as it makes the general election in Britain feel like even more of a pantomime distraction. Because we're at least in Europe, you can see a kind of a direction of travel that looks hopeful for those of us that are appalled by what's been happening for the last generation. Poor old Britain is contemplating, putting in place turbo globalists in the form of a Labour Party that prefers Davos to Westminster.
No, absolutely. And you just mentioned also with your previous guests, I heard a little bit into when you were talking with him. I mean, the amount of work we have ahead of us is quite tremendous, because many of the things we tend to forget, and that of course was a consequence precisely of the kind of, Davos crowd, is that the world economy at the moment is in many ways a zombie economy, right? It's built on debt, it's built on credit, it's built on money printing. And at the same time, when we talk about that manufacturing is going down, what that means is that real work, right? Real production is going down. So it's not just enough to vote for the right party. We really have to also vote for parties that want to bring all of that back, right? That want to put people to work again. And to be honest, I don't see this both in the left of center in Europe. I see it more on the right, which I'm very happy about. We saw it with Trump. But even in the United Kingdom, I mean, I looked at the manifesto of the Labour Party. It seems to me that even they don't even pretend to be in touch with the people. I mean, with the Tories, we know it. But I think it's going to get even worse with the Labour Party. So maybe you can explain it to me. I still don't understand whether British people are now not encouraged by what they saw in continental Europe to say, okay, we might no longer be part of the European Union, but this is a direction which we would like to go as well.
Well, Ralph, in response to that, I would say that, we've all grown up in being certainly internalising the idea that the Tory party doesn't like us as people. But who knew that the Labour Party, the party of the workers, was going to come up on the inside rail and actually outdo the Conservatives when it comes to evidently regarding the working indigenous population of Britain with out-and-out contempt, which underlines the extent to which in Britain we live with a uni-party, where the choice is no choice.
No, and I think it's the same, by the way, in continental Europe as well. So the so-called conservatives are very often also, just as you described it. I think it was more obvious in Britain over the last couple of years. But for example, the German conservatives, the so-called Austrian conservatives, they're all in essence, when it's not an election year at least, they're all left-leaning. It's only during an election year they all of a sudden discover they're conservative or right-leaning or anti-immigration or working-class bona fides. So nobody believes them anymore. And I think we should also, you do this on your show, and I also try to do it myself. I, from now on, refuse to use the term far right. For me, they are, for lack of a better expression, what is usually labeled far right, with a few exceptions. There are a few really far right people out there as well. But what is in the political party system in continental Europe, at least, but I think also in Britain, what is labeled as far right, basically they are what I call, radical normies. They pretty much I think they see the world like you, they see the world like I do, and we are not far right by any stretch of the imagination. I think we are fairly, balanced, well-meaning individuals, and I think that's what most people are. We just started to label those people as far-right extremists or as ultra-hyper, MAGA, whatever it is. And I think we have to claim this back. If normalcy, if being balanced is called far right, fine. If common sense is far right, then I guess we are far right. But then the term is entirely devoid of any meaning.
Ralph, I agree. I opt for sane, actually. I say the sane
Precisely.
people, if not just purely common sense. Greg Swenson, I felt you nodding along with much of what Ralph was saying there. What in particular was chiming with your inner chords?
All of it. I missed the last minute with the sound, but I can argue that one of the reasons that the UK is moving to the party of the left is because there hasn't been a party of the right. Again, this is the so-called Conservative Party that did price caps and windfall taxes, all the things that you would associate with a party of the left. So it's no surprise that they're voting in Labour. It's just a rejection of 14 years of Tory rule that has not been conservative at all. Starting with David Cameron, but right up to unelected Rishi.
Right, David Cameron, right back in 2004, 2005 or whenever it was. He was essentially a Blairite. He was essentially, Tony Blair wearing Conservative clothes.
If you listen to the economic discussions of Boris and Rishi when Rishi was the Chancellor, it sounded like a conversation of Blair and Brown back in 2000, whenever. It's really troubling. And I'm glad to see Reform at least offering people a choice because they are conservative. So, good for Reform and good for Ralph. He's killing it.
Ralph, what do you make of the Reform? Under the new leadership of Nigel Farage, and when I ask that question, I mean specifically the way in which the mainstream media here and others around are seeking to isolate and exile that group here as being, don't look over there. That's irrelevant. Only look at us. Just choose between black and black. Does it just remind you of everything that's happening elsewhere?
Well, in parts. I mean, I have a very simple criteria these days when I decide for whom to vote, and I think the same would apply to British voters as well, which is the party in question, or are the options that I have? Is there a party or politician that doesn't just want to manage decline, but is actually interested in something like a national renewal? And I think that reform under Nigel Farage, at least it seems like, and I want to give him the benefit of the doubt, especially now that he's actually standing for parliament, which took him a while to get there. But I think he really cares about Britain, and he wants to see Britain prosper again, right? He doesn't just want to manage decline. He wants to kind of manufacture a renewal, if you will. And I find that's a good thing. It's the same in continental Europe. This is really kind of the division. Do we say, okay, everything is too late anyways, and we can just try to go gracefully, into the sunset? Or is it the idea to say, no, like, we have not seen the best days yet. There is more to do. It will be hard work. Reforms, as the name of the party says, will be necessary. I think, again, the Brits need to learn, and we in continental Europe as well, we need to get away from, let's say, the managing types, the McKinsey types, and go back to the manufacturing types. Right? This is really, we have to go back to doing things, to making things, to get things done. Just one quick example. It's not a British one, but I think it's not a good one. If you think about the Empire State Building, was built in 18 months. Right? I think the Tower Bridge in London was built in 6 years. We need to learn to do this again. Nowadays, you cannot build a bridge under 20 years. And I want people in office to say, get away with regulation, get away with all the red tape. It's time to kind of unleash, if you want, the capacity and the capabilities that I think the country still has. And I think Farage potentially is more likely, like the ocean liner in continental Europe, to make this slow turn than any other alternative.
I'm very interested and encouraged there by your use of renewal, because a word that I think I would like to hear people using as well is renaissance. I think people bandy about revolutions are only ever destructive, and they're only ever. It's just encouraging the mob to do the bidding of the elite. But I think we need renaissance as well as renewal. Ralph Schulhammer, as always, great fun to talk to you, and an education every time. Thank you. I'm running out of time. In fact, I've run out of time. So I can only say thank you for watching the Neil Oliver Show. Thanks to all my guests, in particular panellist Greg Swenson. Always lovely to have you there by my side. All being equal, I'll see you same time next week.